And so begins the reign of Joe and Anthony Russo, as well as writers Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, who would go on as a team to direct and write arguably the 3 next most important movies in the entire MCU. Why did Kevin Feige give them the keys to the MCU after literally 1 movie? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. Spoilers ahead for Captain America the Winter Soldier. You've been warned. So, the MCU was chugging along, and at the time, the superhero genre was really beginning to gain its footing. In 2008, both The Dark Knight and Iron Man exploded onto the scene, allowing people to realize, oh wait, maybe superhero films can actually work and not be goofy, campy messes that they used to be. I mean, of course, you had the previous X-Men and Spider-Man films, as well as a couple good Batman movies, but really 2008 was when it really took off. Fast forward to 2014, and, well, it was still the superhero genre. Of course, the groundbreaking success of the Avengers opened people's eyes to the idea of a shared cinematic universe, absolutely, but if you closely re-examine the Avengers, it is undoubtedly a comic book movie, a superhero film. And rightfully so. It works brilliantly in that regard. And yes, while other movies like Thor and Thor the Dark World were trying to push the envelope forward ever so slightly with the fantasy genre as well as being a superhero film, at the end of the day, they're still unapologetically superhero movies. But guys, Captain America the Winter Soldier is not a superhero film, just as much as Iron Man 3 is not a Christmas movie. And I know this is a huge debate and you can argue about it with me in the comments down below if you want, but I maintain that it's not a Christmas movie just because it takes place at Christmas. That's a whole different story though. At any rate, in much the same way, even though the Winter Soldier has superheroes in them, it itself is not a superhero film at its core. It's a spy thriller, and that's why this movie is so transcendent. Because Joe and Anthony Russo, who, by the way, had only really done small TV work on the show Community before jumping into the MCU, threw off the notion of what a traditional superhero film was and just decided to make a great movie with these superhero characters, much in the same way that Christopher Nolan did with The Dark Knight. One small thing that I noticed that I rather enjoyed was the fact that for the majority of the movie, these characters aren't actually wearing their costumes. You'd think in a superhero film the point would be to flash the costumes in the red, white, and blue colors and the bravado, but really, for over half the movie, these characters are on the run and just normal people running from the government. I'd seen a couple of the new Mission Impossible films in the past few years, and this really felt more like one of those movies than anything else in the MCU thus far and since. There's intel that Steve and Natasha are trying to unravel while being chased by the corrupt government. It's such an excellent premise. However, no movie is perfect, and here's my single biggest criticism about this movie. The story, for the first part at the very least, is very complicated to the point of being confusing and a little self-indulgent, and certain plot points are not conveyed to the audience very well. I had to pause this movie at least 3 times to go onto the internet in search of answers to questions that I had about the plot regarding Fury and the Lumerian Star. Now, if you're anything like me, in the previous viewings of The Winter Soldier, you watched the film and kind of brushed over these plot elements. You were like, oh yeah, Hydra kind of undermined S.H.I.E.L.D., they had to beat up some pirates on the Lumerian Star, which is a ship or something, and by the end of the movie you came to the basic realization that Hydra, bad, Captain America, good, and you have your conflict. Every time I saw this movie before, I always had this nagging feeling in the back of my head of, how does this make sense for certain plot points, but I quickly brushed them aside. But this time, I dug into the plot, and guys, I don't know if I just missed these things and you understood them, but this is the plot, I'm going to explain it to you, of The Winter Soldier, and buckle in because it's about to get messy. So, before the events of this film even take place, Nick Fury begins to become suspicious of Project Insight, the project where they're developing next-gen helicarriers to target people like terrorists and bad people before they can harm any innocent civilians. Right away, this is a plot thread that really isn't conveyed well into the film. You're sort of meant to fill it in as you go that he was suspicious of them in the first place. The Lumerian Star, I guess, is an important ship because it contains information and ultimately Zola's algorithm for Project Insight. And Fury's suspicious, so he hires Batroc the Leaper to hijack his own ship. I don't know about you guys, but I always thought that this wasn't true because Alexander Pierce, when explaining this theory to Captain America, dismisses it as fake. But it's actually true according to what I looked up. Fury did in fact hire Batroc the Leaper to hijack his own ship so that he could then send Steve Rogers to lead a mission to rescue the prisoners, one of which included Jasper Sitwell, who was a Hydra agent and was on the Lumerian Star to prepare for Insight or something. But what Fury really wanted was Natasha to grab the intel that he, as director of S.H.I.E.L.D., technically owned anyways, so that no one would know that he was snooping around, which is in fact what the flash drive was about. And then, when he tries to access the files, it's denied and overridden by himself, which I guess we're meant to believe is just a Hydra trick so that he can't access the files, but that's how Hydra knows that he's onto them. So they then go after him to try to kill him, but he escapes magically with some sort of tunneling device or something, which is another part of this movie that's a little strange. And then he heads to Captain America's apartment where he reveals that S.H.I.E.L.D. has been compromised. But then he gets shot, and hands the flash drive to Captain America, who hides it in a vending machine. And sidebar, this movie is otherwise brilliant, and I will get back to the positives as soon as this is over, I promise, but I have to knock this movie when it's due. Seriously, writers? Captain America hides the most valuable information arguably in the entire country in a vending machine? I don't know how else it could have been done, but there are so many ways that could have gone wrong. Anyways, then Alexander Pierce talks to Cap and confuses the story even more. So Pierce says that yes, the prevailing theory is that Nick hijacked his own ship, which is true, allegedly, but Pierce wants to cover up the fact that he knows Fury is going after Hydra. So he lies and says Fury was killed because he was actually trying to sell the information. When Cap refuses to tell him why Fury was at his apartment, Pierce, as head of Hydra, orders him to be killed. He and Natasha go after the source of this file, which is to Artem Zola, which is actually another trap designed to kill them, and then we get to the part of the plot that actually sort of makes sense. Is anybody still watching this video? Again, let me reiterate, maybe I just missed all of this and that's my fault, but I've talked with a couple people and the general consensus seems to be, yeah, we were vaguely aware of this plot, but it wasn't super important to the story, so we didn't bother following it in the first place. I can completely see that in the writer's room before this movie started production, that they were hashing out this entire backstory and connecting all the dots. Because on paper, this storyline is pretty alright. There's a couple conveniences, but otherwise it makes logical sense. But the execution, I think, was a little sloppy in places. What I mean by execution in this sense is the way that it was conveyed to the audience so that the audience has a better understanding of what this story is, because obviously the storytellers know all the information in the first place. Again, this may seem like a giant nitpick because, granted, you don't really need to understand any of this nuance in order to enjoy the film, but I also do think that it's equally as important to present your story in such a way to where it's accessible to the audience. I don't think you'd want every audience member having to pause this movie and look up things in order to figure out the plot on their 20th rewatch of the film. I don't know, maybe that's just me though. Anyone still here? Because let's talk positives. And don't worry, because there are a lot. First of all, the action. Oh my goodness, the action. I mean, from the very first set piece on the Lumerian Star, this film establishes right away that it's something else with the action. The camera work is unbelievable, and it's some of the best hand-to-hand combat that I've seen in any movie, period. And the way that they use Captain America's shield in this movie suddenly makes it feel way less gimmicky and way more formidable. Although it doesn't necessarily align with their characters, it was interesting to see Captain America being a little more vicious. He wasn't pulling any punches and he was just throwing knives around and smashing people's head with his shield. It was a completely different side and tonal shift to Captain America, and like it or not, the Russos stuck with it for the remainder of the film. They also did amazing work with the character of Natasha Romanoff. When you watch the MCU films, you can clearly tell a difference between the Whedon Widow and the Russos' Widow, and personally, I much prefer the Russos' take on Black Widow, because she just feels so much more like a person. In the first two Avengers films, she almost feels like a caricature, like a prototypical spy, but in this movie, the brother-sister dynamic of her and Steve works so brilliantly. The temptation may have been to make her a love interest to Steve, but I'm so glad that they didn't do that and really stuck with the platonic relationship for this film, The Winter Soldier, which allows her character to, shine even more. The inclusion of Nick Fury is always welcome, and of course the introduction of Falcon was great. I love the opening scene where they really establish with so little dialogue how he and Steve could be so compatible as teammates as well as friends. By the way, speaking of the opening, as soon as this movie opens, it feels so much more assertive. The previous few MCU films have been really trying to gain their footing, but right out of the gate, this movie just feels a lot more confident that really soars throughout the rest of the film. And while I do miss Alan Silvestri's iconic score, though it does play a little bit at the beginning of the movie, Henry Jackman, to his credit, actually does a really phenomenal job of mixing the music with the action scenes. It just heightens the tension and the thriller aspect of the film. While the music isn't as recognizable or hummable as Silvestri's, it integrates itself remarkably into the rest of the film. But the biggest thing that this movie has going for it, especially compared to the other MCU films, is its heart. The core of the story may not really focus on the Winter Soldier as much as the title may suggest, but as soon as the subplot really gets going, which is around the 2/3 mark when Steve realizes Bucky's identity, then it becomes such an integral part of the story. And the end of the Avengers, yes, the ending battle is cool and everything, but there just aren't that many emotional stakes. But here, what the Russos do is actually really smart in that they end the quote-unquote superhero conflict by saving the helicarriers and stopping Project Insight, but then after that, they still end the climax of the story on Steve and Bucky, which is what makes this movie that much better. Speaking of Bucky, let's talk about the villains of this movie. People have mixed feelings on Alexander Pierce, and while yes, if you're part of Hydra, it's hard to be a convincing villain because you're just supposed to be evil for the sake of being evil. However, I thought through Redford's performance and some clever writing, they were able to really make this villain convincing. There's a scene at the end where he's talking to Nick before he dies where it really seems like he believes that Hydra will be giving the world a new order that it so desperately needs. And to the writer's credit, that adds some real depth to him. Is he the best MCU villain? No, certainly not, but does he lose anything because he's not clunking around in a giant metal suit? That's not correct either, and I refuse to acknowledge that as an argument. Physical fighting is not always what makes a good villain. And on a different note, while I do think Bucky was used well at the end, he really wasn't used at all that much in this movie, and intentionally so, his character was pretty one note. As such, it was cool to see him on screen being this incredibly dangerous assassin, but he almost felt like a henchman for most of the movie. It really feels weird to call this movie The Winter Soldier because, oddly enough, a lot of this movie really doesn't focus on the Winter Soldier, at least not until the end. But in the end, Captain America The Winter Soldier is one of the greatest movies that Marvel has ever put out. Now, on paper, and I have to emphasize this because it's important, on paper, this movie is probably the best in the MCU. The plot is pretty airtight, the stakes are high for the characters, the action is superb. Again, I believe on paper that this is the best MCU movie, although we'll see as we go along this rewatch series. But, especially after seeing the rest of the MCU in hindsight, this movie does lack a little oomph, a little extra. There is no one particular scene in this movie that really stands out. Overall, everything's extremely good in almost every facet, but there just isn't that one thing that jumps out at you, like a Thanos in Wakanda, or a portal scene, or an airport battle, or a Thor goes full God of Thunder in Ragnarok. And that's not this movie's fault, and it doesn't detract from the movie at all. I'm just letting you know that right now, up front, I may very well give this movie the highest rating that I will out of any of the MCU films that I review in this rewatch series, but that doesn't mean I will rank it at the top of my personal, subjective rankings when it comes time for that. Because I feel like there's just that one little thing that this movie lacks that other MCU films have. Either way, this film is incredible, and for all the reasons I listed above, I will give Captain America The Winter Soldier an A+ and a 9.6 out of 10.
Oh, man. I am so fired.
Well, we at least know FedEx hired him. Comment down below with your favorite moment from The Winter Soldier. 2014 was a big year for Marvel, and we're moving right along to Guardians of the Galaxy. Make sure to subscribe and hit the like button for more content. If you'd like to see more right now, check out the videos that are on the screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.